What if in 1971, after the Stones released Sticky Fingers, they broke up? They broke up. Keith Richards' heroin was out of control. The band was stumbling. Brian Jones died in 1969. He was sort of the originator of the band. I don't know if you realize that. So they were faltering, and Keith's was out of control. So they didn't really have a guitar player. So let's say Mick Taylor didn't work out either. He was too pretty. Whatever. The Rolling Stones break up in 1971. And they go on to make solo records. But the Beatles didn't break up in 1970. They stayed together. They had their squabbles, but somehow they held it together. And the records that they made in real life, in our universe, really became Beatles records, like George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. That was a Beatles album. You know, Paul McCartney's first record, which was very Beatlesque, was a Beatles album, and Ram was a Beatles album, and John Lennon's Imagine record, or it was the first record, Plastic Ono Band, was a Beatles record. It had George Harrison in real life. It had George Harrison and Ringo were playing on it. It was fleshed out more, and it was a Beatles record. And all of those early Beatles solo records that, if you're a fan, you know, they had a lot of Beatle-esque creativity coursing through them, and they, in this alternate version of history, became Beatles albums. And the Beatles stayed together. They never broke up to this day in 2019, but they just started recycling old stuff, and they became what the Rolling Stones, in fact, are, an oldies band, that they just played their hits from the 60s and stuff, and they're still touring, they're still playing arenas. And could that have happened? Could it have happened, really, that the Rolling Stones break up and the Beatles stayed together? That's the gist of what I'm saying here. And it's so fascinating to think about, because the Stones, if they had broken up, yes, Mick would have made solo records, Keith, because in fact they did, but they would have made solo records. It didn't have anywhere near the power of the Rolling Stones. I mean, it's funny to think about it now, that in real life, the Rolling Stones, people don't go to see the Rolling Stones, they go to see the Rolling Stones play songs from 50 years ago. So they're not really there to see the Stones, they're there to hear those songs from a long time ago. So in some bizarre way, they did break up. They lost their creative juice in the early 70s. Not literally at 71 with Sticky Fingers. Let's say 72 with Exile on Main Street, which is one of my big favorites. But the dream, the fantasy, the alternate universe story is that they break up, the Beatles stay together, they make more records, as the Beatles, really great records, because if All Things Must Pass and John's Plastic Ono Band and Paul McCartney's Ram, if they actually were Beatles records, they would have been better records. Better, I think, in every way. Because I think the four of them collaborating, working off each other, was better for them. I think as solo artists, they never, ever reached the creative zenith that they did as Beatles. So they would have been better for it. The music would have been better for it, and in this fantasy of mine, they would have stayed together, and eventually lost their mojo and started just repeating themselves and playing stadiums, and the fans would have wanted to only hear songs from the 60s and early 70s, and the Beatles would have become what the Rolling Stones are, the world's greatest oldies band. But I don't know. It's sad in a way. It's sad that the Beatles broke up, and it's sad that the Rolling Stones didn't, because the Rolling Stones did make good records after the 60s, but not for me, not in a creative way. That didn't really happen. They became essentially a blues band, like a structured rock and roll band that never really veered too far off the straight and narrow of what they were doing. They didn't want to upset their fans. They just said, hey, this is what people like, let's just play that. Well, the Beatles' whole shtick was, in the 60s, to just try new things all the time. And if they could have somehow kept that up as a band that continued into the 70s and 80s and 90s and aughts and teens, but they would have got that far, what would the music that they would have created been like? That we'll never know. We really can't know, because even their solo albums, especially as time went on, just kind of petered out, really. So we'd have no glimpse of what they would have been if they had stayed together, except this little fantasy of mine. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you've had similar thoughts or any ideas about what I just said, please leave those ideas in the comments section directly below this video. As always, thank you for watching, and if you like it, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, share these videos, give them a thumbs up. If you dig it, keep coming back, and I will be forever grateful. I'll be grateful as long as you do come back. Anyway, you know I'm joking around. See you soon. Bye-bye.